The morning Peter left Lagos, the lighthouse keeper Miguel stood at the edge of the cliff waving goodbye, a man transformed by a single night of adventure and connection. Peter waved back, feeling the bittersweet pull of leaving someone who had briefly but meaningfully touched his life. This was the nature of his new existence. Constant movement, temporary connections, moments of profound meaning followed by inevitable goodbyes. From Lagos, Peter made his way back to Lisbon, spending one night in the city where he had encountered Mariana and made his decision to walk away from his inheritance. The streets felt different now. Lighter, less weighted with expectation and obligation. He was truly free, and that freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. At the Santa Apollonia train station, Peter purchased a ticket for the international night train to Toulouse, France. The journey would take him across the Portuguese countryside, through Spain, over the Pyrenees mountains, and into southern France. A geographical crossing that felt symbolic of the larger journey he was on. The train departed at 9 p.m., and Peter found his assigned compartment in the sleeping car. Unlike the private cabins he might have afforded in his previous life, he had chosen the economical option, a six-berth compartment where strangers would share the long night together. It was the kind of choice a true backpacker would make, and Peter was committed to living authentically in this new identity. When he arrived at his compartment, 3 of the 6 berths were already occupied. An elderly French woman sat by the window, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she gazed at the Lisbon evening. A Spanish man in his 30s lounged on one of the lower bunks, a guitar case resting beside him, and a young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, sat nervously on the edge of her bunk, clutching a small backpack as if it contained everything precious in her life. "Bonsoir," Peter greeted them, his French limited but earnest. The elderly woman smiled warmly. "You are American?" she asked in accented English. "Yes, from Chicago. I'm Peter. I am Marguerite Dubois, but please call me Madame Dubois. Everyone does." She gestured to the others. "This is Carlos, and the young lady is Sophie." Carlos raised a hand in greeting but said nothing, his eyes distant. Sophie offered a shy smile before looking back down at her hands. As the train pulled out of the station and began its journey north, 2 more passengers arrived. A middle-aged Portuguese businessman who immediately buried himself in his laptop, and a young backpacker who climbed to an upper bunk and fell asleep within minutes. The compartment settled into the peculiar intimacy of strangers sharing confined space. The businessman worked, the young backpacker slept, but the 4 who remained awake, Madame Dubois, Carlos, Sophie, and Peter, began the delicate dance of deciding whether to maintain polite distance or risk genuine connection. As the train left Lisbon behind and entered the Portuguese countryside, darkness falling over the landscape, Madame Dubois spoke again. "This is my first time on this train in 50 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of that half-century. "The last time, I was going the other direction, leaving France, leaving everything I knew, following my husband to Brazil." Peter found himself drawn in by her tone. "You lived in Brazil for 50 years? 52 years, she corrected. "We built a life there. My husband had work in Sao Paulo and I adapted. That is what we do for love, yes. We adapt, we transform, we become new versions of ourselves." Sophie looked up from her hands, listening. "But your husband?" Peter asked gently. "You said had work." "He passed away 2 years ago," Madame Dubois said, her eyes still on the darkening landscape. "After 52 years together. And I realized something after he was gone. I had become so Brazilian, so transformed, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be French. So I decided to come home, to spend my final years in the country where I was born." The compartment was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the train on its tracks. "Are you afraid?" Sophie asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken. Madame Dubois turned to look at the young woman, and her expression softened with understanding. "Of dying in France after so long away? Yes, a little. But I am more afraid of dying in Brazil, having never returned. Never seeing the places of my childhood again. Never breathing French air and walking French streets one last time." "I think that's brave," Sophie said. "And I think you are brave too, my dear," Madame Dubois replied. "I can see it in your eyes. You are also leaving something behind, also traveling toward an unknown future. That takes courage at any age, but especially when you are young and the world expects you to follow a certain path." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, but Peter could see that Madame Dubois had seen through to the heart of the young woman's story. Carlos, who had been silent until now, spoke for the first time. "We are all running away on this train," he said in Spanish-accented English. "Some from death, some from life, some from ourselves. But we are all moving because staying still was no longer possible." "Are you running away, Carlos?" Peter asked. The Spanish man smiled sadly. "Or running toward. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference." As the train crossed from Portugal into Spain, Carlos told his story with the practiced rhythm of someone who had lived it so many times in his mind that it had become a kind of song. He had been a street musician in Barcelona for 15 years, playing guitar in Las Ramblas and Plaza Real, earning enough to survive but never enough to truly thrive. He had talent. Everyone told him he had talent. But talent alone wasn't enough in a city full of artists all chasing the same impossible dream. "I am 37 years old," Carlos said, his fingers unconsciously moving as if playing invisible chords. "Old for a street musician. Most of the others are young, full of hope and energy. But I cannot stop. Music is not something I do. It is something I am." "So why are you leaving Barcelona?" Peter asked. "Because I realized that I was becoming a ghost in my own life. Every day the same, play for tourists, collect coins, sleep in a small apartment, wake up and do it again. No progression, no growth, just existence. I felt myself disappearing." Carlos pulled his guitar from its case and held it gently, like a lover. "In Toulouse, I have a cousin who owns a small cafe. He has offered me a position, play every night, earn a steady wage, have security. It is not the dream I had when I was 22, but it is a different dream and maybe a better one." "You don't sound convinced," Sophie observed quietly. Carlos smiled at her. "No, I am not convinced. I am terrified that I am giving up, settling for less, admitting defeat. But I am also terrified that if I stay in Barcelona, I will wake up at 57, 67, still playing for tourists who do not really listen, still disappearing a little more each day." He began to play softly, a melancholy Spanish melody that filled the compartment with beauty and sadness. The Portuguese businessman looked up from his laptop, caught by the music. Even the young backpacker in the upper bunk stirred in his sleep. When Carlos finished, Madame Dubois wiped tears from her eyes. "That was beautiful," she said. "And I will tell you something. My husband was an accountant. A good one, a successful one. But he always wanted to be a painter. He kept that dream inside him his whole life, and it made him sad in ways he tried to hide. When he died, I found dozens of paintings hidden in our garage. Beautiful works he had created in secret, too afraid to show anyone, too afraid to fail." She looked directly at Carlos. "You are still playing. You have not hidden your music in a garage. You are taking your dream to a new city, finding a new way to live it. That is not giving up. That is evolving." Carlos nodded slowly, absorbing her words like medicine for a wound he hadn't realized was still bleeding. The train entered the night in earnest now, the Spanish countryside invisible beyond the windows, only their reflections staring back at them from the dark glass. The compartment lights were dimmed for those who wanted to sleep, but the four who were talking moved closer together, creating a small circle of shared confidence and temporary intimacy. Sophie's story emerged gradually, in fits and starts, as if she was still deciding whether to trust these strangers with her truth. She was from a conservative Turkish family living in Germany. Her parents had arranged a marriage for her with a cousin back in Turkey. A good man, they assured her, from a good family who would provide stability and honor. The wedding was planned for the following month. "But I do not love him," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I have never loved him. I love art. I love painting and sculpture and the way museums smell like old wood and possibility. I want to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Toulouse. I have been accepted. I have a scholarship. But my family says it is shameful for an unmarried woman to leave home, that art is not a proper pursuit. So you ran away, Peter said. 2 days ago, I told them I was visiting a friend in Munich. Instead, I came to Portugal to make them think I went the opposite direction. Now I am going to Toulouse to begin school next week. By the time they find me, I will already be enrolled, already living in the dormitory, already free. Her voice broke on the last word, and tears finally spilled down her cheeks. But I am so scared. What if I am making a terrible mistake? What if they are right and I am being selfish? What if I fail at art and have thrown away my family for nothing? Madame Dubois reached out and took Sophie's hand. My dear child, I left France for love and never regretted it. Even though it meant leaving my family, my language, my entire world. You are leaving for love too. Love of art, love of yourself, love of the life you want to create. That is not selfish. That is brave. But what if I fail? Sophie asked again. Then you fail, Carlos said with unexpected gentleness. And you learn and you try again or you try something else. But at least you will have tried. At least you will not be like Madame Dubois's husband, hiding your paintings in a garage because you were too afraid to let the world see them. Peter found himself thinking about his own recent choice, walking away from billions of euros and centuries of family legacy. I think, he said slowly, that failure after trying is less painful than regret after never trying. I just made a huge decision that everyone told me was foolish, that I'm still not sure was right. But I knew that if I didn't make my own choice, I would spend my whole life wondering what if. What did you choose? Sophie asked, wiping her tears. Freedom, Peter said simply. I chose freedom over security, my own path over inherited obligation. It's terrifying, but it's mine. The four of them sat in silence for a moment, each contemplating the courage it takes to choose your own life over the life others plan for you. Chapter 4. Peter shares his story. The Portuguese businessman had given up on work and was now listening openly to their conversation. Even the young backpacker had woken and was lying quietly in his bunk, absorbed in their stories. Tell us your story, Peter, Madame Dubois said. What brought you to this train? So Peter told them. Not everything. Not the details about the network or the hidden chambers or the complicated politics he'd left behind, but the essential truth. He told them about working in Chicago in a job that paid well but cost him his integrity. About deciding to leave everything behind and come to Europe. About discovering a family history he hadn't known existed. About being offered enormous wealth and responsibility and choosing to walk away. I've spent the last few weeks traveling through Spain and Portugal, Peter explained. Meeting people, hearing stories, trying to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by my work or my family's expectations. And I've learned that everyone is on some kind of journey, physical, emotional, spiritual. We're all trying to find our way. And have you found yours? Carlos asked. I don't know yet, but I think maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to find a final answer, but to keep asking the question. As midnight approached, the train began its climb into the Pyrenees, the mountain range that forms a natural border between Spain and France. The ascent was gradual but noticeable, the train's rhythm changing as it navigated steeper grades and sharper curves. We are crossing the mountains now, Madame Dubois said, looking at the window where their reflections had been replaced by occasional glimpses of rocky slopes and distant lights. The Pyrenees have always been a place of crossing, people fleeing wars, seeking new lives, following dreams or running from nightmares. These mountains have witnessed so much human courage and fear. I read somewhere, Sophie said, that during World War II, thousands of people crossed the Pyrenees on foot, escaping from Nazi-occupied France into Spain. They walked for days through mountain passes, carrying everything they owned, not knowing if they would survive. My grandmother was one of them, Madame Dubois said quietly. She walked from France to Spain with her 2 small children, my mother and my uncle. My grandfather had been killed in the war. She crossed these mountains in winter with babies, surviving on courage alone. The weight of that history settled over the compartment. They were crossing the same mountains now, in comfort and safety, but the echoes of all those other crossings seemed to travel with them. "It makes our problems seem small," Carlos said. "No," Madame Dubois disagreed. "Every person's struggle is real to them. My grandmother fled war, but her granddaughter fled heartbreak. Sophie flees family pressure, Carlos flees stagnation, Peter flees. What? Expectation? The wrong kind of success? Each of these escapes requires courage, even if they are not all equally dangerous." "What about you?" Sophie asked the Portuguese businessman, who had been listening silently. "Why are you on this train?" The man looked surprised to be addressed. "Business meeting in Toulouse," he said in accented English. "Nothing so profound as your stories." "But do you like your work?" Peter asked. The man hesitated. "It pays well." "That is not the same thing," Carlos observed. "No," the businessman admitted. "It is not." Around 3 a.m., the train reached the highest point of its journey through the Pyrenees. The compartment had grown quiet, some passengers sleeping, others simply absorbed in private thoughts. Peter stood in the corridor outside the compartment, watching the dark mountain landscape slide past, thinking about all the conversations of the evening. Madame Dubois joined him at the window. "You cannot sleep either? Too much to think about." "That is the gift of travel," she said. "It gives us time to think, space to see our lives from a different perspective. In our normal routines, we are too close to our problems to understand them. But on a train crossing mountains at night, with strangers who become friends for a few hours, we can see more clearly." "Do you think we'll stay in touch?" Peter asked. "Carlos, Sophie, you, me. After tomorrow morning, will we just become a memory?" "Probably," Madame Dubois said honestly. "But does that make tonight less real? Does that make what we have shared less meaningful? Some connections are meant to be brief but intense, like a beautiful song or a perfect sunset. They are not less valuable because they do not last forever." Peter thought about Mariana, about the connection between them that felt both profound and uncertain. Would that turn out to be another brief but intense connection, or something that could endure? "You are thinking of someone," Madame Dubois observed with the perceptiveness of age. "How did you know?" "Because you have that look. The look of someone who has found something precious but is afraid to hold it too tightly in case it breaks." "There's someone," Peter admitted. "A woman I met during my travels. It's complicated." "Love is always complicated," Madame Dubois said. "My husband and I had 52 years together, and every single one of them was complicated in some way. That is not a flaw, that is life. The question is not whether it is complicated, but whether it is worth navigating the complications. How do you know if it's worth it? When you would rather face the complications with her than have simplicity without her." The train began its descent toward Toulouse, leaving the mountains behind and entering the gentle rolling hills of southern France. Dawn was approaching, the sky beginning to lighten at the edges, transforming from black to deep blue to the first hints of gold. By 5:30 a.m., most of the compartment was awake, faces pressed to windows as the French countryside became visible in the growing light. Fields and farms, small villages with church steeples, the landscape that had been home to Madame Dubois 7 decades ago and would be home to Carlos and Sophie beginning today. "I am nervous," Sophie admitted. "We all are," Carlos replied, his guitar already back in its case, ready for his new life. At 6:45 a.m., the train pulled into Toulouse-Métabio station. The platform was nearly empty at this early hour, just a few people waiting for arriving passengers or preparing for their own journeys. The 6 temporary companions stood on the platform together, the businessman already hurrying toward a taxi, the young backpacker waving a casual goodbye before disappearing into the station. But the 4 who had shared their stories stood in a small circle, reluctant to let go of the temporary family they had formed. "I will think of you all," Madame Dubois said. "When I walk the streets of my childhood, when I sit in French cafes, when I prepare to die in my homeland, I will remember this night and these conversations, and they will comfort me. Sophie hugged the elderly woman fiercely. Thank you for telling me I am brave. I will try to believe it. Carlos shook Peter's hand. Maybe we will cross paths again, brother. Europe is large, but the community of wanderers is small. I hope so, Peter said sincerely. They exchanged contact information, knowing that probably none of them would reach out, that this was the ritual ending to a perfect temporary connection. But there was comfort in the ritual, in the pretense that this wasn't really goodbye. Finally, they went their separate ways. Madame Dubois to a taxi that would take her to her sister's house. Carlos to an address written on a piece of paper. Sophie to the university office where she would begin registration. Peter stood alone on the platform as the sun rose fully over Toulouse, his backpack at his feet, a new country stretching out before him. The night on the train had reminded him why he had chosen this life. Not because it was easy, but because it offered moments of genuine human connection, conversations that mattered, stories that resonated across differences of age and nationality and circumstance. His phone buzzed with a text message. From Mariana. I heard you're in France now. How was Portugal? I'm in Nice for work. If you head that direction, maybe we could meet. No pressure. Just thinking about you. Peter smiled, Madame Dubois's words echoing in his mind. When you would rather face the complications with her than have simplicity without her. He texted back, Toulouse today, but I think the Riviera sounds perfect. I'll head that way soon. As he walked out of the train station into his first French morning, Peter felt the weight of last night's conversations settling into his bones like good medicine. Madame Dubois returning home to die, Carlos chasing a modified dream, Sophie fleeing toward freedom. All of them were his companions in courage, fellow travelers on journeys that mattered. And somewhere ahead, in the warm sunshine of the Côte d'Azur, Mariana was waiting. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. Because maybe their connection was one of the rare ones that would last beyond a single night, beyond a single conversation. Peter hoisted his backpack and walked into Toulouse, ready for whatever came next.